So the bombing has stopped. Maduro's been shipped off to New York, and the media, they've already found their next shiny object. But don't be fooled. The crisis in Venezuela is far from over. In fact, it's spreading like a cancer. What began as a single military op in Caracas has now ballooned into a high-stakes naval showdown in the North Atlantic. It's exploded into a border security emergency down in Colombia. It's creating deep diplomatic rifts all across Latin America, and now it's morphing into something that it seems no one in Washington ever saw coming, a head-to-head confrontation between the United States and Russia, and it's all centered on one single oil tanker. Just 3 days back, a tanker with ties to Venezuela trying to escape US ships in the Caribbean slapped a Russian flag on its side and changed its identity from the Bella One to the Maranera. Then it filed new paperwork to become a Russian vessel. Right now, that ship is sitting 230 miles off the Irish coast. And get this, Moscow has dispatched a submarine and warships to give it a personal escort. This right here is what escalation actually looks like. It's not some big flashy explosion. It's a quiet, steady build-up of pressure that turns local problem into a global powder keg. So today I'm going to break down for you exactly what is going on at this very moment. We're not talking about last week's news from Venezuela. We're focused on what's developing right now, out in the Atlantic, on the ground at the Colombian border, and behind the closed doors of diplomatic summits where nations are being forced to pick a side. Because let me be clear, this has moved way beyond Maduro. This is now about enforcing oil sanctions, the laws of the sea, the sovereignty of nations, and the huge question of whether our global system can even handle these kinds of conflicts anymore, or if these clashes are just going to smash what little is left of that system. I'm going to show you what's really going on. Let's start with the so-called blockade, the one that's failing. Back on December 16th, President Trump declared what he billed as a, quote, total and complete blockade on every single sanctioned oil tanker heading to or from Venezuela. He even went on Truth Social, claiming the country was completely boxed in by the biggest armada ever put together in the history of South America. Big words, right? The reality on the ground was a lot less impressive. If you look at the data from multiple tracking outfits, we're talking tankertrackers.com, Windward, Maritime AI, plus deep dive analysis from both Bloomberg and the New York Times, at least 16 oil tankers have managed to slip right through this blockade since Maduro was taken on January 3rd. 16, that is not just a few stragglers, we're talking about a highly organized mass departure. These vessels were hauling roughly 4 million barrels of crude and fuel that absolutely made it out of Venezuelan waters. And on top of that, another 12 ships carrying an estimated 8 million more barrels were seen leaving Venezuelan ports in what looks for all the world like a massive, perfectly timed exit. Samir Madani, who co-founded tankertrackers.com, pointed out that the timing was just too perfect. Every single one of those 16 vessels bolted the second Maduro was captured. He said they took off right after the operation went down, and the only way it could have worked was if it was a massive synchronized move. So what we're really witnessing isn't a blockade that actually works. What we're seeing is a high-stakes game of cat and mouse on the high seas, and it turns out the mice are very, very good at hiding. These ships belong to what intelligence circles call the Dark Fleet. They're vessels that play by their own rules completely outside of standard maritime law. For instance, they'll just switch off their automatic identification systems, those transponders that are legally required to broadcast their position and speed to stop ships from crashing into each other, or they'll spoof their location, faking their AIS signals to make it looks like they're in a completely different part of the world, sometimes clear across an ocean. According to a Reuters report, this global shadow fleet is made up of over 1,400 tankers. And get this, more than 920 of them have been hit with sanctions from the US, the UK, or the European Union. But here is where the real problem lies. Only 40% of the Dark Fleet vessels that service Venezuela are actually on America's sanctions list, which means a full 60% of them, hundreds and hundreds of ships, are completely untouchable under Trump's blockade order. So when the administration comes out and says they're running a total blockade, what they actually mean is that they're attempting to catch a small fraction of ships that were literally built from the ground up to evade capture. Now the US has managed to grab 2 of these tankers, the Skipper around mid-December and the Sentries near the end of the month. Both of these operations required Coast Guard maritime securities teams, special ops personnel from the Marine Corps, and helicopters that were launched from aircraft carriers. But nabbing 2 ships when there are potentially dozens of them out there, calling these attempts a blockade, that's just not accurate. It's more of a disruption, and you need to understand why that distinction is critical, because for Venezuela, oil isn't just another part of the economy, it's the entire circulatory system. We're talking about almost 90% of all the money the country makes from exports. If this so-called blockade was actually effective, if no tankers could get out, the Venezuelan economy would absolutely implode in a matter of weeks. Their storage tanks would hit capacity. The oil fields would have to stop pumping, and just a bit like that, the government's main cash cow would dry up. But that isn't what we're seeing. Sure, production is down. And yeah, a few tankers are tied up at the docks, but the crude is still getting out. The money is still coming in. The whole operation is finding ways to survive. Which brings us to a ship called the Maranera, a tanker that single-handedly sparked an international crisis. Its original name was the Bella 1. In the shipping world, they call it a VLCC, a very large crude carrier. And believe me, these things are absolutely enormous. This particular vessel used to fly the flag of Panama. It landed on the Treasury Department's sanctions list back in 2024 during the Biden administration because it was caught up in the Iranian oil trade. Then this past December, with American forces closing in, the people running the ship pulled a very clever move. They slapped a fresh coat of paint on the hull complete with a Russian flag. They renamed it the Maranera, and they filed new paperwork registering the tanker with the Russian Maritime Authority. And then Russia gave its official stamp of approval. Moscow formally acknowledged the vessel as a Russian-flagged ship, and therefore under Russian protection, and that creates a huge problem. See, stopping a ship that's illegally flying a fake flag, pretending to be from somewhere it isn't, is one thing, but going after a vessel that has legitimate papers from a sovereign nation, that's how you start a major diplomatic incident. The Maranera was last spotted about 230 miles from the Irish coast. American Coast Guard cutters were on its tail. The US Navy had its P-8A Poseidon aircraft in the air. These are the planes they use for hunting submarines and conducting long-range surveillance missions, patrolling the skies off Scotland and Ireland, KC-135 refueling. Tankers were circling nearby. They even had C-130 transport planes and U-28 special ops aircraft on some station. This was not a casual watch-and-see situation. This was the prelude to a full-blown interception. And that's when Russia sent in a submarine and warships to act as the tanker's personal bodyguards. A couple of US officials confirmed this to CBS News. The Wall Street Journal broke the story first. And in an instant, what started as a simple law enforcement action morphed into something far more dangerous. Because now you've got American military hardware and Russian military hardware all converging on the exact same spot in the ocean, with both navies on orders from their governments and both of them determined to achieve goals that are mutually exclusive. The United States' mission is to seize that tanker. Russia's mission is to escort it and make sure that doesn't happen. This isn't just a standoff, this is a direct confrontation that has the potential to blow up into something much bigger if anyone makes a wrong move. On Monday, reporters asked President Trump about the situation during a press conference down at Mar-a-Lago. He said, quote, "It's moving along and we'll end up getting it. Yeah, we're actually pursuing it. Can you imagine it came from the wrong location? It came out of Venezuela and it was sanctioned." End quote. But the real question is, will the US actually go through with seizing the Maranera now that the Russian Navy is on the scene? That's the big unknown. The administration isn't talking. Operations like this can get called off, strategies can shift, and it looks like the Maranera might not be a one-off case. According to the official Russian shipping register, at least 3 other sanctioned tankers working in the waters near Venezuela have also recently switched their flags to Russia. So what we're witnessing here is a brand new playbook. Sanctioned tankers are dodging the US by running for cover under Russia's flag, and it seems Moscow is more than happy to help them out. This sets up a scenario where every single time the US tries to intercept a ship, it could mean a run-in with the Russian military, where grabbing a tanker could spark a full-blown diplomatic crisis. The American blockade was already having a tough time getting ships to comply, and now it's up against a geopolitical roadblock that makes the job exponentially more difficult. Meanwhile, Colombia is mobilizing on its border. While all this drama is unfolding out on the Atlantic, a whole separate crisis is heating up on the ground. The president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, has mobilized his security forces all along the 2,219-kilometer border that they share with Venezuela. He's sent in extra soldiers. He's put emergency plans into effect, and he delivered a speech that made everyone in the region sit up and take notice. Petro didn't just condemn the American strikes. He declared that any attack on Venezuela is an assault on the whole of Latin America, and he drew a clear line in the sand warning that Colombia would not stand by if instability from its neighbour started spilling over the border. Now here's what you have to understand. Colombia is a key US ally. It gets a massive amount of military aid. It's a partner on the ground for drug enforcement operations. For years, it's been one of Washington's most dependable friends in the entire hemisphere. But Petro is a different breed. As a former leftist guerrilla, his worldview has never aligned with that of previous Colombian presidents. He's called out US policy in the past. He's demanded a complete overhaul of the war on drugs. His entire platform has been about finding regional answers to regional crises. And in this moment, he's casting Colombia, not necessarily as a defender of Maduro's regime, but as a guardian of Venezuelan sovereignty itself. In other words, he's defending Venezuela's right to figure out its own future without foreign military interference. And this isn't just political theatre, because Colombia's connection to Venezuela is more than just a line on a map. They share entire communities. You have families living on both sides of that border. Commerce flows in both directions, and millions of refugees, literally millions, have poured into Colombia over the last decade trying to escape the economic implosion. So if Venezuela tips into total chaos, if a power vacuum opens up, if criminal gangs start to operate with impunity, Colombia is the one that has to absorb the shockwave. We're talking more migration, more cross-border violence and drug trafficking, routes getting completely destabilized. So Petro's moves aren't just symbolic, they're intensely practical. He's getting ready for scenarios where Venezuela's instability becomes a direct threat to Colombia's national security, and he's making it perfectly clear that Colombia will have no part in any military gamble that makes those nightmare scenarios more likely to happen. But there's a deeper game being played. By taking a stand against the US operation and positioning Colombia as a champion of sovereignty, Petro is also sending a powerful signal to the rest of Latin America. What he's really saying is, we've got to have each other's backs. We need to make it known that one country deciding to take unilateral military action in our backyard is completely unacceptable. And that message is finding fertile ground. The entire region is responding as one. This is the point where the Venezuela crisis balloons into something much bigger. Because what we're seeing isn't a few scattered protests. It's a synchronized move. Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Chile, Spain and Uruguay didn't just issue their own statements. They released a joint condemnation, a single unified statement. That is a massive deal. We're talking about 6 countries, some left-leaning, others centrist, and even a major European power, all speaking with a single unified voice delivering the same exact message. They said this was a blatant violation of sovereignty, that it establishes a dangerous new precedent, and that it cannot be allowed to become the new normal. Brazil's President Lula da Silva went even harder. He said the US strikes had crossed, quote, an unacceptable line, and he called for the United Nations to step in and take action. He stated, attacking countries in flagrant violation of international law is, quote, the first step toward a world of violence, chaos and instability. Over in Mexico, President Claudia Sheinbaum blasted the military action as a direct threat to regional stability. She hammered home the point that unilateral interventions put the entire hemisphere in jeopardy, and she did all this while carefully maintaining cooperation with Washington on other huge issues like border security, trade and migration. It was a masterclass in balancing interests. Denounce the Venezuela operation forcefully, but avoid blowing up the entire relationship. That's the definition of walking a diplomatic tightrope. Chile's government put out a statement that stressed the importance of respecting international law and the UN Charter. Uruguay voiced almost identical concerns. And Spain, which is a European nation with incredibly deep historical and cultural roots in Latin America, stated it does not recognize unilateral interventions that fly in the face of international law. This is a unified bloc responding, and it reveals something fundamental that wasn't the case a decade ago. The countries of Latin America are far more willing to work together, far more willing to push back against pressure from the United States, and far more willing to declare, we have our own set of interests, and they don't always perfectly align with what Washington wants. A piece of this is ideological, no doubt. Many of the current governments lean to the left or the centre-left. They are inherently suspicious of American military force. They have long memories of past interventions in places like Guatemala, Chile, Nicaragua and Panama, and they see the ghosts of that history being resurrected in Venezuela. But another piece of this is just cold, hard, practical reality. China is now the #1 trading partner for most of South America. Chinese money has financed the construction of ports, highways, and critical energy infrastructure across the continent. The game has changed. Nations around the world now have other options. They are no longer shackled to the American economy the way they used to be. So when the US decides to go it alone to brush aside international bodies, or to use its military without getting a global green light, these other powers can actually afford to push back. They have the leverage to unite and declare we don't accept this. And that evolution from isolated grumbling to a united regional front is a deep structural shift. It's not some fleeting issue that will disappear once the Venezuela crisis is off the front page. Picture this: on December the 20th, the UN Security Council convenes an emergency meeting. The topic on the table is the Venezuela operation, and country after country starts raising alarms about maritime law and the sanctity of national borders. Sure, a couple of nations, Panama and Argentina, sided with the United States, but many others condemned the move. The Chinese delegate was blunt, saying the US action tramples on international law and Venezuela's sovereignty, creating a threat to peace throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. Russia's envoy called it sheer lawlessness, a throwback to the Caribbean Sea's old days of state-sanctioned theft, or where piracy and banditry were just business as usual. Iran's foreign ministry didn't pull any punches either, labelling the tanker seizures flat-out acts of piracy that have no standings in the international rulebook. Now I know what you're thinking. It's easy to write these off. Russia, China, Iran, they're America's rivals, so of course they'll take shots. But whether they're hypocrites or not is beside the point. The real story is that the United States is losing the information war badly. Now even nations with their own questionable track records like Russia and Ukraine, or China, with its sweeping claims over the South China Sea, can now gesture towards Venezuela and argue, see, America doesn't follow the rules either. This is what a credibility crisis looks like. When the United States stomps on the very principles it supposedly champions, it completely guts its own authority to police anyone else. And this is critical because the entire system of international law hinges on a collective belief that it applies to all players, big and small. If it only serves to tie the hands of the weak while the powerful do whatever they want, it stops being law. It becomes nothing more than the will of the mighty. The UN Secretary General even released a statement voicing his deep alarm, warning that this operation in Venezuela is setting a dangerous new standard for global norms. He was careful not to call it illegal. He didn't demand sanctions. He simply registered his concern, which is the standard move for a UN chief when a superpower decides to ignore the rulebook. He sounds the alarm and hopes someone somewhere is listening. But the underlying systemic flaw doesn't go away. The United States wields a veto at the Security Council. Any resolution to condemn what happened is dead on arrival. The International Court of Justice. It has no power over the US on this issue. And the Organization of American States is hopelessly fractured and utterly toothless. So in practical terms, there's no comeback. The US can pull off its operation, other nations can issue their angry press releases, and the needle doesn't move, except for the intangibles, except for how the world sees America, except for the willingness of other countries to get on board with Washington for the next crisis. Those things die a slow death. But once they're dead, it takes generations to bring them back. Now let's get into the economic angle, the oil markets and the shadow tankers, because we need to talk about what this really means for the money. This blockade, even if it's not perfect, is having a tangible impact. Venezuelan oil output has taken a serious hit. It's not a complete shutdown, but it's a significant slowdown. According to the maritime AI firm Windward, a minimum of 16 tankers that showed up to either load up on crude or unload naphtha, which is a chemical they use as a thinner to help export Venezuela's super thick, tar-like oil, are now effectively impounded inside Venezuelan harbours. Some of these tankers are being turned into offshore storage barges simply because they dare not sail into international waters where they could be seized. Venezuela's onshore storage tanks are hitting capacity, and when your tanks are full, you have no choice but to slow down production. You can't just keep pumping crude out of the earth if you have no place to put it. This is how you apply economic pressure on the Venezuelan regime. Fewer oil exports translate directly into less cash flow. Less cash flow makes it harder to meet public payroll, keep basic services running, or buy the continued support of your allies. But this isn't a silver bullet, not by a long shot, because the Ghost Fleet is still out there running the shadows. These ships are dodging the blockade, and certain buyers, with China leading the pack, are more than happy to snap up Venezuelan crude, risks be damned. If you look at the economic data from CEIC, Venezuela was still pushing out over 655,000 barrels a day back in 2024. Now that's a massive drop from their peak in the early 2000s, but it's still a serious amount of oil. And while the blockade has definitely choked off some of that supply, it hasn't killed it. The real question we need to be asking is what happens when the US decides to turn up the heat? What if Washington starts grabbing ships in open waters with more gusto, or if it starts twisting the arms of insurance giants to blacklist any tanker that even points its nose toward Venezuela? What if they unleash secondary sanctions on any bank caught processing payments for all that oil? That's when the economic vice gets tightened to a whole new level. But every single one of those moves carries a steep geopolitical price. Snatching ships leads to direct standoffs with powers like Russia. Squeezing insurers throws a wrench into the entire global shipping industry, and those secondary sanctions, they tick off allies who have no interest in seeing their own banks excommunicated from the dollar system. This is the bind they're in. The United States has the power to make the blockade ironclad, but doing so means sparking more international incidents, burning more diplomatic capital, and basically daring other nations to create their own financial systems that don't need America's permission to operate. In the middle of all this, the global oil markets have been surprisingly quiet. We didn't see prices explode, so why not? It's because Venezuela's current output sitting under 1 million barrels per day is honestly a small enough piece of the pie that taking it off the board doesn't really rock the global supply boat. But what's happening here sets a dangerous precedent. If the US can successfully put a chokehold on Venezuela, who's to say they can't do it to other nations, Iran or even Russia? At what point does enforcing sanctions turn into a naval war in everything but the official declaration? These are the whispers now turning into serious conversations among traders and analysts, and the answers they find will define this landscape of energy markets for the next decade. Now let's talk about the fog of war and misinformation. I have to address something that's been making the rounds online. You've probably seen the videos claiming to show US Marines or Coast Guard teams storming tankers. You've seen the clips of Black Hawk helicopters hovering ominously. You've heard the chatter that a whole fleet of ships has been taken down in these wild operations. Here's the deal, some of that is true. The takedown of the skipper in mid-December was absolutely confirmed. We even saw video from that raid released by Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. But a lot of the other stuff, especially the really slick videos of helicopter assaults, or Marines fast roping onto decks, has never been confirmed by any credible major news organization. This is a critical distinction to make. In today's conflicts, a story can circle the globe before the truth even gets its boots on. Social media acts as a massive amplifier for anything that looks dramatic. People hit share on videos without ever questioning the source, and often old clips from entirely different situations get a new title slapped on them and passed off as happening right now. Look, I'm not here to tell you every claim is a lie. What I'm telling you is that they are unconfirmed, and in a high-stakes game like this where you have multiple world powers with conflicting agendas acting on unverified reports isn't just foolish, it's dangerous. It can pour gasoline on diplomatic fires, it can whip up public outrage that forces a government's hand, and it can cement a narrative in people's minds long before the actual facts come to light. So when these videos pop up in your feed, you have to ask, who is the original source of this? Has anyone actually verified it? Which reputable media outlets are reporting this as fact? Are there official government sources backing this up? This is the discipline of real analysis. You have to draw a hard line between what has been proven and what is merely being alleged, and you must demand proof before you accept anything as gospel. Because in this new world where everyone has a camera in their pocket and a platform to shout from, the real challenge isn't accessing information, it's discerning the truth. So what does this all mean for the future? Where does this leave us? The reality is the Venezuela operation has morphed into something far messier and more complicated than anyone in Washington bargained for. This is no longer just some domestic law enforcement issue. It's now a naval blockade that is fundamentally struggling to maintain its grip. It has become a diplomatic firestorm with Russia. It is creating a massive border security crisis for Colombia. It has become a flashpoint for regional sovereignty that is actually bringing Latin American governments together in opposition, and ultimately it's shaping up to be a live-fire test of whether the United States can still bend a nation to its will with economic and military force without starting a much larger conflict. The consequences on the world stage. And from what we're seeing so far, the answer is a hard no. The blockade is already full of holes. Oil tankers are slipping through the net. Russia is running protection and a chorus of Latin American nations is pushing back. The United Nations is sounding the alarm, and the classic American playbook of sanctions and ship seizures isn't working as well as it used to. Washington is finding its opponents are learning and adapting faster than ever. Now, this doesn't spell failure for the operation just yet. The United States wields immense financial and military might. It can keep this pressure up forever. It has the power to grab more vessels. It can layer on even more sanctions. The US can always choose to escalate, but turning up the heat comes with a price, and that bill is getting steeper by the day. The trust with its partners in the region is wearing thin. Close calls with Russian forces are becoming more frequent, and a dangerous new precedent is being set that powerful countries can just use military muscle to get what they want. And you can be sure others will use that playbook later. China is watching very closely. In fact, every country with natural resources the US might covet is watching, and they're all walking away with the same exact game plan. Untangle yourself from American financial systems, diversify your partners, and hedge your bets. This is the kind of strategic damage that never makes it into a Pentagon press conference. The slow bleed of soft power. The global push for countries to build their own alternative systems. The world is changing right before our eyes, morphing from a system supposedly governed by rules into one governed purely by raw power. And once that shift is locked in, once everyone agrees that might makes right, the entire world becomes far more dangerous, because power is always up for grabs. Rules are meant to create stability. Power just creates a fight. And so we have this crisis that was supposed to be small but just keeps getting bigger. The plan for Venezuela was simple and clean. A quick surgical operation, get rid of Maduro, put in a friendly government, get the oil flowing smoothly again, and then just move on. But the plan to keep it contained fell apart. Now the crisis is spilling over borders, poisoning diplomacy and wrecking economies. It's turned into a high-stakes naval game in the North Atlantic. It's fueling a border crisis with Colombia. It's created a diplomatic rift that splits Latin America right down the middle. It's become a crucial test for the future of international law. And it's a stark reminder of the very real limits of American power. The bombing may have stopped, but the fallout is only now beginning. They say history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. And the situation we're watching unfold has the same rhythm as those moments in the past when great empires stretched themselves too thin, when they got cocky and assumed their power was enough to remake entire parts of the world without asking. When they forgot the simple truth that while force can certainly topple a government, it can never ever create legitimacy. Venezuela is going to be a moment people remember, not because of the operation itself, but because of what it pulled back the curtain on the shifting nature of global power, the death of the old rules of international conduct, and the newfound courage of other nations to stand up and say no. So the cat-and-mouse game with the tankers goes on. The blockade struggles to hold, the diplomatic poison continues to spread. And right now, somewhere out in the cold North Atlantic, a Russian submarine is shadowing an oil tanker, while American warships watch from a distance. Both crews are locked in, both are running the numbers, and both are asking themselves, what is our next move if this whole thing goes sideways? That's the reality. That's the real story. Not the one you got a glimpse of on the news last week. This is the one that's happening in the shadows right now, long after everyone else has looked away.